Welcome to this deep dive. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to wake up in 2025 and America's totally different?
Different like how?
Like, shaped by a conservative vision. So ambitious, they call it, taking down the deep state.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking at today.
Okay.
We've got two really interesting documents. One is called Project 2025.
Okay.
It's from the Heritage Foundation. And the second one is US Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025. It's kind of like getting a sneak peek at a future run by conservatives, like a blueprint.
Yeah, what I find really interesting is that these documents aren't just reacting to what's going on politically right now.
Right.
Project 2025 in particular seems like a serious plan to actually change the government.
Oh, wow.
They had over 100 different organizations and 400 experts working on it.
So they're not messing around. They want to give power back to the people. But how are they going to do that?
Well, that's the big question.
Let's start with the hot button issues. They talk about finishing the wall at the border, deporting immigrants who are here illegally, making it easier to get oil and gas here in the U.S., and giving more control over education to parents and states instead of the federal government.
I see.
You're starting to see a theme here.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about shifting power away from the federal government
Right.
and back towards states and individuals.
Yeah.
They even talk about maybe banning transgender athletes from competing in women's sports.
Oh, wow.
Which is sure to be controversial.
For sure. And speaking of controversial, we need to be really careful with all the information that's out there,
For sure.
There have been so many misleading claims about Project 2025 going around.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's been crazy. Thankfully, fact checkers from all over the political spectrum, CNN, PolitiFact, USA Today, even the Daily Signal, they've debunked a lot of it.
Well, that's good to know. It's a good reminder to double check everything.
Exactly. Like, one thing they've made clear is that Project 2025 didn't come directly from Trump. And it wouldn't end gay marriage. And that video of J.D. Vance everyone's talking about, totally unrelated. So let's stick to the facts.
All right. Sounds good.
What's the reality of this mandate for leadership they're proposing? What's in this giant policy overhaul?
Well, you can think of it like a blueprint for a complete government makeover.
Wow.
They're targeting everything: immigration, education, energy, national security. The goal is to make the federal government much smaller.
So it's not just ideas, right?
Right.
They have actual strategies to make these changes happen.
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
They're not just coming up with policies, they're getting ready to put them into action.
Oh, wow.
Project 2025 includes these 3 extra parts beyond just the policies. It's personnel, training, and a 180-day playbook.
Okay, break that down for me.
So imagine a database of conservatives, all vetted and ready to take on government roles.
Okay.
And then there's a training academy to get them prepared.
Oh.
And finally, a really detailed plan of what they'll do in the first 180 days if they get into office.
Wow, that's serious. They're not just theorizing, they're actually building an entire movement, aren't they?
It really seems that way. And that's where our second document, U.S. Policy Adjustment Expectations 2025, comes in. It takes a closer look at how this vision could actually play out, focusing on specific departments.
Okay, so let's zoom in on a few of the departments where the changes would be felt most strongly. Let's start with Homeland Security. DHS.
Right.
They're talking about restructuring things in a pretty big way.
Also.
Imagine FEMA, the agency that helps after natural disasters just gone.
Interesting.
How would that change things for people?
Well, it would be a huge shift. And they also propose taking all the different immigration agencies and combining them into one unit within DHS.
So everything about border control and visas would be under one roof?
Exactly. And they want to eliminate some visa categories entirely.
Wow. So that would make it a lot harder for certain people to come into the U.S. So less government help with disasters and stricter rules on immigration. Those are pretty major changes right there.
Yeah, definitely. And it doesn't stop there. They also want to take control of education and funding away from Washington, D.C.
Really?
And put it more in the hands of parents and states.
So your local school board would have a lot more say in what your kids learn.
Exactly.
Now, that's something that would hit close to home for a lot of people.
For sure. And it gets even more interesting when you look at their plans for the U.S. intelligence community.
Oh, okay.
They want those agencies to be more proactive in dealing with threats, especially from China.
Right.
But they also want to make sure that intelligence gathering stays objective and isn't used for political purposes.
So more aggressive intelligence gathering, but with stricter controls to prevent abuse.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance.
For sure. And they want to shake up student loans too, right?
Right.
What are they thinking there?
Well, they want to change things so that private lenders give out the loans again, with the
Oh.
government just backing them up.
Okay.
And they also want to look into whether people are abusing student loan forgiveness programs.
This is really shaking things up. And it's not just about cutting programs, is it?
No, not at all.
They're also talking about moving some programs around, like taking food assistance programs, things like SNIP and WIC, and moving them from the USDA to Health and Human Services.
Exactly. They're also talking about changing the Affordable Care Act. They might separate the subsidized health insurance market from the non-subsidized one.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. We've only just scratched the surface of these documents, and we're already seeing a completely different America in 2025.
I know, it's fascinating, right? And the details get even more interesting as we go deeper.
Well, stay with us then, because in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to unpack even more of these potential changes.
Definitely.
And we'll talk about what they could mean for you.
Welcome back. We're going to keep looking at how this conservative vision might actually work in different departments.
All right, so we've seen how they want to shake up Homeland Security, education, and healthcare. What about the economy? How does the government fit in with things like commerce in their vision?
Well, they want to shrink the government's role there, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Take the Department of Commerce.
Okay.
They're suggesting merging or even getting rid of some bureaus and functions.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a future where all those government agencies that track the economy and do the census, they're all combined into one.
That's pretty major streamlining. And what about NOAA?
NOAA?
Yeah, the agency that handles weather forecasting and fisheries and stuff. They're looking at big changes there too, right?
Oh, yeah, they are. It's a big shakeup. They might even break up NOAA and give its different parts to other agencies, or maybe even privatize some of them.
Whoa. So our weather forecasts and fishing rules could be handled by private companies.
Potentially, yeah.
That's a big shift. What other agencies are they looking at? We're talking about smaller government overall, right?
Exactly. And that thinking applies to places like the Small Business Administration, the SBA.
Okay.
They want to get rid of the SBA's direct lending program and just encourage private banks to lend to small businesses. And they're not even sure if disaster loans should be handled by the SBA anymore.
So less direct government involvement and more reliance on the private sector. Got it. What about trade?
Ah, yes.
That's a huge part of the global economy these days. What are they proposing for the Export-Import Bank, Exim?
You mean the one that helps finance American exports?
Exactly.
They're actually considering getting rid of X's completely.
Whoa, hold on. Abolishing Exim. Isn't that pretty radical? Wouldn't that hurt American businesses trying to compete globally?
Well, they argue that Exim mostly benefits big corporations, not small businesses,
I see.
and that it distorts the market by giving those big companies an unfair advantage.
So their thinking is that getting rid of government intervention would create a level playing field.
Exactly. They believe that would actually help American businesses and taxpayers in the long run.
Okay, I can see their point, but it still seems pretty risky. Now, let's get back to national security. We talked about their plans for DHS, but what about the State Department? What kind of changes are they thinking about for America's diplomats?
They're proposing a major overhaul, focusing on making sure the State Department's leadership is on the same page as the president when it comes to foreign policy.
So a more politically driven State Department?
You could say that.
Yeah.
They also want to be more cautious about international agreements.
How so?
They would freeze any efforts to implement treaties that haven't been ratified by the Senate and review existing ones to make sure they align with their goals. They're even talking about withdrawing from international organizations if they think those organizations aren't effective or go against U.S. interests.
A more America first approach to diplomacy, then.
Exactly. And when you look at specific countries, they're really focused on China, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and North Korea.
Those are some of the big players on the world stage.
Right. They see these countries as the main threats to U.S. interests, and they want to come up with stronger strategies to counter them.
Sounds like they're taking a pretty aggressive approach to foreign policy. What about things like international broadcasting, the kind of stuff that countries use to promote their values and interests abroad?
They want to beef up America's international broadcasting capabilities big time.
Really?
They see it as a way to spread pro-freedom messages and counter what they call hostile propaganda from countries like China and Russia.
So a more active role for the U.S. in shaping global opinions. Okay, we've covered diplomacy and trade, but let's go back to national security and talk about the intelligence community. What do they see as the future of intelligence gathering and analysis?
They want the intelligence community, or IC, to be more assertive. especially when it comes to anticipating and stopping threats from China.
Okay, so being more proactive.
Exactly. But at the same time, they also want to make sure that intelligence analysis stays unbiased and doesn't get mixed up with politics.
So more aggressive intelligence gathering, but also concerns about politicization. It's a tricky balance.
It is. And to achieve that balance, they suggest strengthening the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI.
OD&I.
Yeah, basically giving them more control over the budget and oversight to manage things more effectively. And they want to reform the CIA, too.
Reform the CIA. How so?
They want a director who can create what they call a mission-driven culture that's really focused on tackling national security threats.
Sounds like they want some big changes at Langley. What about the concerns about intelligence agencies being used for political reasons?
They're taking that very seriously. They want to make sure that never happens again.
Okay.
One of their main goals is to restore public trust, and they're suggesting some pretty strong measures to do that.
Like what?
Like auditing past instances of politicization and abuse of intelligence, and even revoking security clearances for former officials who talk about their work publicly without permission.
So cracking down on leaks and any misuse of classified information. Makes sense. Now, we've talked a lot about China as a threat. What specifically are they proposing when it comes to gathering intelligence on China?
China is their top priority. They want to create a whole new China Mission Center within the intelligence community.
A whole new center.
Yep, with all the people and resources they need to counter what they see as a growing threat from China.
So a major investment in understanding and countering China.
Exactly. They also want to increase the intelligence budget for China and maybe even share more intelligence with allies in the Asia-Pacific region.
So building a coalition to push back against China's influence. What about other changes to how intelligence is gathered and analyzed?
They're really focused on making sure that different viewpoints are included in intelligence assessments, even if those views challenge the mainstream thinking.
Interesting. So encouraging debate and diverse opinions, even if it's uncomfortable.
Right. And they want to hold senior leaders accountable if they try to suppress or manipulate analysis. They're trying to foster a culture of open debate and really thorough analysis.
That's a pretty big change from how things have been done in the past. What other reforms are they suggesting for the intelligence community?
They want to make the system for classifying and declassifying information more transparent and accountable.
Okay.
They also want stricter controls on who can access data, to prevent leaks.
Right.
And they want to improve methods for protecting undercover officers, especially with all the digital threats these days.
Makes sense. It's a whole new world out there for intelligence agencies.
It is, and they're proposing reforms to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA as well.
FISA, yeah, that's the one that deals with surveillance powers, right?
Exactly. They want to prevent it from being used for partisan purposes and make sure those powers are used responsibly.
So they want to give intelligence agencies more power to deal with threats, but they also want to protect civil liberties and prevent those powers from being abused. It's a tough balancing act.
It definitely is. And we haven't even talked about their plans for the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services, or the Department of Defense.
Sounds like we still have a lot to cover.
We do. Stay with us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll look into those departments and learn even more about this conservative vision for America's future.
We're back for the last part of our deep dive into this conservative vision for 2025. We've talked about national security and diplomacy and education and healthcare.
It's a lot.
It is. But we have a few more key areas to tackle. Let's start with the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC.
Okay.
They play a big role in keeping businesses in check and protecting consumers, right?
Exactly.
So what's the conservative approach to antitrust and consumer protection?
Well, the documents outline a sort of balancing act. They want to make sure those antitrust laws are up to date, especially with all the challenges from big tech.
Right.
But they're not looking to just abandon antitrust enforcement altogether.
So not a complete free pass for big corporations.
Right. They're not just focused on prices either. They're looking at how all that market concentration might be affecting other things, like democracy and how consumers are doing overall.
Interesting. So they're acknowledging that corporate power can be a problem, but they also don't want to stifle innovation.
Exactly.
What else is on their agenda for the FTC?
They're proposing investigations into how corporations are using things like ESG and DEI.
ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance, right?
Yeah.
And DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are pretty hot topics these days.
They are. And what they're suggesting is that these practices, while often seen as good things, might actually be used to hide anti-competitive behavior.
That's interesting. Imagine a future where the government is actually scrutinizing corporate diversity initiatives. What would that do to companies and the workplace?
It's a big question. It would definitely change things.
For sure. It sounds like they're pretty skeptical of some of the motivations behind these corporate initiatives.
They are. They also want the FTC to do more to protect kids online, especially from things like harmful contracts and advertising. They're suggesting that the way these platforms interact with kids could be seen as deceptive or unfair.
That's a huge issue, given how much time kids spend online these days. What else is in store for the FTC?
They're recommending more cooperation with state attorneys general,
Yeah.
and maybe even giving FTC regional offices a bigger role. It's about being able to handle local issues and enforce things more effectively, kind of bringing antitrust and consumer protection closer to home.
So a bit of decentralization, that seems to be a recurring theme here.
It is. Overall, their vision for the FTC seems to be about finding that sweet spot, between trusting the market and stepping in when necessary to protect consumers, especially kids.
Makes sense. All right, let's move on to the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. That's another huge one that affects so many parts of our lives.
Absolutely. HHS oversees Medicare and Medicaid and food safety and disease control. It's a lot. And these documents lay out a big agenda for the department, one that's very much based in conservative values.
Okay, break it down for us. What are some of the key things they want to do?
One major focus is on protecting life, conscience, and what they call bodily integrity. This means things like prohibiting funding for abortion travel and for Planned Parenthood, enforcing the Hyde Amendment and other laws that protect conscience, and rolling back policies that require abortion services under EMCALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act.
So a very clear stance on abortion reflecting that conservative perspective. What about healthcare reform more broadly?
They want patient-centered, market-based reforms.
Okay.
Less regulation, more control for states over the medical profession, and a reformed insurance system that's more transparent and costs less.
So less government involvement in healthcare and more reliance on market forces and states to make decisions. That's a pretty big shift.
It is. They also want to support policies that encourage what they call stable, married, nuclear families. So addressing things like fatherlessness and changing adoption rules to prioritize biological parents.
A very traditional view of family, for sure. It's interesting how those social values are woven into their policy ideas. What about preparing for future health crises? Did they learn anything from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, they talk about restructuring the whole federal public health system,
Okay.
making it more transparent and efficient, clearly defining what a public health emergency is and when it ends, and limiting the power of public health officials to issue mandates without really strong scientific backing.
So they're worried about public health officials having too much power.
It seems that way. They want to make sure individual freedoms are balanced with public health measures.
That makes sense. Are there any big changes proposed for specific agencies within HHS, like the CDC or the FDA?
Yes. Yeah. For the CDC, they want to split it into two parts.
Two parts.
Yeah. One focused on collecting data and the other on making public health recommendations. They also want to stop the CDC from issuing guidelines that tell people what to do, making sure it just provides information.
Okay.
And they want to ban the CDC from taking money from drug companies through the CDC Foundation.
So concerns about conflicts of interest there. What about the FDA?
They want to make sure generic drugs can enter the market more quickly, which could lower prices for everyone. They also want to change how laboratory-developed tests are approved and address drug shortages by encouraging more reliable generic drug manufacturing.
So streamlining the FDA and making the drug market more competitive. What about Medicare and Medicaid? Any big changes planned for those?
They want to give patients more control over their healthcare choices, reduce regulations on doctors, and reform how those programs are financed to encourage innovation and efficiency. They also want to take another look at the No Surprises Act, the one that protects patients from unexpected medical bills, to make the dispute resolution process better. And they're proposing separating the subsidized and non-subsidized markets in the Affordable Care Act's health insurance exchanges.
So some pretty significant changes to how the Affordable Care Act works, and a push to bring more market forces into Medicare and Medicaid.
Exactly. And when it comes to the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF, they want more transparency and accountability in programs like TANF, temporary assistance for needy families.
Okay.
They also want to promote adoption reform, protect faith-based adoption agencies, and move the Office of Refugee Resettlement to the Department of Homeland Security.
So tying refugee resettlement more closely to national security. All right, we've covered a lot with HHS. Let's wrap things up with our final department, the Department of Defense, DoD.
Oh, well.
What's their vision for the military?
They want a strong military. They see it as the key to national security, deterring enemies, and maintaining America's dominance globally. It's a peace through strength kind of approach.
Okay.
They want to modernize the armed forces, make sure everyone's accountable, and deal with new threats, especially from China and Russia.
So a pretty hawkish stance on defense. What exactly are they proposing?
They want to bring back command accountability in the military,
Okay.
making sure it's not about politics, but about being ready to fight. They also want to transform the military to be ready for competition with other powerful countries, focusing on technology and strategy.
So basically, getting the military ready to keep up with China and Russia.
Exactly. And they want the military to help DHS with border security. They see that as a national security issue.
So kind of blurring the lines between domestic law enforcement and national defense.
It's something we've been seeing more and more lately. They also want to make sure the DoD is being financially transparent and accountable, making sure they're using taxpayer money wisely and not wasting anything.
Makes sense. What about specific threats? We've talked a lot about China, but Russia is still a major concern, right?
They see China as the biggest threat, and they want to stop China from taking control of Taiwan and the first island chain. They want to be sure the U.S. can win any potential fight with China and focus resources on that.
Okay.
They also want other countries, especially NATO members and other allies, to spend more on their own defense and take on more responsibility for their own security.
Sharing the burden, so to speak. What about the U.S. nuclear arsenal?
They want to expand and modernize it to be able to deter both Russia and China at the same time. They also want to develop new capabilities at the regional level to counter potential nuclear threats from smaller countries.
So keeping a strong nuclear deterrent in a world with multiple major powers? What about fighting terrorism?
They acknowledge that terrorism is still a threat, but they think the U.S. should maintain its counterterrorism forces at a reasonable cost, working with allies and partners to share the load.
Okay. So shifting some of that responsibility to other countries. What about other aspects of defense policy? What else are they thinking about?
They want to reform how the DoD buys and maintains equipment, making it more efficient.
Okay.
They also want to strengthen the defense industry here in the U.S.
Okay.
and improve how quickly new technologies can be deployed.
Right.
They want to boost foreign military sales, deal with personnel shortages by getting more people to join and stay in the military, strengthen intelligence capabilities, and improve missile defense systems. It's a lot.
It is. It's
Yeah.
a huge to-do list covering pretty much every part of defense policy.
It reflects a view that America is facing serious challenges from powerful rivals, and they believe the U.S. needs a strong military to prevent attacks and protect its interests.
So there you have it. We've taken a deep dive into two really interesting documents that lay out a possible conservative vision for America's future. They want to reshape the federal workforce, change immigration policies, strengthen the military, reform healthcare. It's a lot. These ideas represent a big shift in the political landscape.
And remember, this is just one vision, one perspective on how to handle the complicated challenges America's facing.
Right.
Whether you agree with these ideas or not, they're a powerful force in American politics, and understanding them is important if you want to understand what's coming next.
Absolutely. No matter what your political views are, these documents give us a chance to really think about the kind of future we want for our country and what role the government should play in our lives. Those are important questions.
They are. And as always, we encourage you to dig deeper, do your own research, and form your own opinions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.